You will come back, my friends. Skirt.
Picture it. It's 1974. The nation is gripped with the Watergate scandal that is rocketing towards crescendo, with the American public anxiously awaiting the conclusion and all feverishly wondering if President Nixon is about to become the second most notorious convicted criminal in United States history. The first sits quietly in a solitary confinement cell inside of one of the most secure prisons known. But suddenly, footsteps can be heard coming down the hallway, past the cells of hardened, violent, fearsome criminals, until they stop outside his cell. Suddenly, the door swings open, and Special Agent Joe Shea walks in, ready to deliver news that has been years in the making. Frank, the FBI needs you, and we're prepared to allow you to walk and become a free man, so long as you promise to work with us to stop any would-be master thieves in your wake, seeing as it was a once-in-a-lifetime stroke of luck that we were able to bring you down. We cannot afford this again. Then Frank snaps awake from his daydream and jots that down in his notes. See, that is essentially what Frank would have us believe are the events and conditions surrounding his release from prison. That he was plucked from his prison cell and brought to work with Joe Shea at the FBI under the direct supervision of then-director Clarence Kelly, and from there, sent on incredibly important undercover work such as cash as many bad checks in 3 days as you can, which at the time would have provided absolutely no benefit because it wasn't like the FBI didn't understand how check forging worked, and many actual convicted forgers had done the method Frank was doing well before him and were doing it much better than he was.
What a dumbass.
His claims also extend to everything from creating educational materials for the Bureau to being sent into secret labs in New Mexico and into a military base as an expert on missiles. And he has changed his story a bit over time, going from telling it as working for the FBI to working with the FBI, which he does still purport to do when pressed. These claims have since been scrutinized by many former high-ranking FBI agents, even going all the way back to when he first started making them. People like Eugene Stewart, the man who was in charge of the FBI's Atlanta division, during the exact time Frank's timeline stated he was working for them, and so someone that would most certainly have had knowledge of any arrangement such as this. Stewart would later go on to be Delta Airlines Vice President of Corporate Security as well, and so he may in fact be the person best positioned to know what Frank Abagnale would be able to bring to the table, which he maintains even to this day is not a whole lot. The reality of the matter appears to line up with Frank's MO regarding the rest of his entire story, that he had a very small role in a couple of seminars that he offered to lend his hand to. A kernel of truth that was exaggerated so vociferously, it eventually overshadowed what actually happened. Unfortunately, though, the fact is most of the folks that were responsible for busting Frank's scams and bringing him in the multitude of times he was arrested were local authorities, and the FBI plays a very small role in the whole thing. But that hasn't stopped many people associated with the Bureau over the years taking their opportunity to lend blind credence to it all in exchange for a picture and a handshake from a celebrity purporting to have been a useful tool to them. Those same types of exaggerations appear to have extended to Frank's relationship with the man who he claims is the real-life Carl Hanratty, Joe Shea. Frank did finally name Joseph Shea as Hanratty in later speeches and also in his 2007 book, Stealing Your Life. In his original autobiography, he had previously said that after his escape from the prison in Atlanta, that Shea was so exasperated that he retired weeks later. But this isn't true because Shea did not retire until several years later on December 31st, 1977. Frank maintained they remained great friends up until his death in 2005, and points to the fact that he was at the Catch Me If You Can world premiere 2 years earlier when he was in his mid-80s. Although the two notably curiously only had one short interaction during the whole thing, which would paint a different picture. Joe never had a son. He adopted me in that role. He personally came to see me. He personally worked the release deal. Joe Shea gave me a second chance. I am not saying it is not possible that this is true and Shea just wanted to keep a low profile, but knowing what we have laid out about Frank in this, It's also entirely possible that Joe Shea was wholly unaware of just how deep Frank had involved him in the grandiose tale, and he was just waiting for Shea to be too old and eventually no longer here to be able to poke any holes in those claims. I suppose either could be true, but what we can state for sure as fact is that at the very least, it did not happen in the way Frank claims, because again, we know the details now of his actual release from prison. As part of the US Code Frank was sentenced under, he could be paroled at any time without having to serve any sort of minimum. And it's likely that when he underwent psychiatric treatment while serving his time, that this was sufficient enough for him to finish his sentence under supervised probation, and as such, he was officially released March 9th, 1973. At this point in time, he settled for a bit in Houston, Texas, which he claimed was part of the condition of his parole that he must go there and start doing undercover jobs. However, by the time summer of 1974 rolled around, he would be back in his pilot's outfit again, attempting another scam, this time on a much different mark. During the heyday of summer camp culture, Camp Mansion in Friendswood, Texas was the epitome of what children looked forward to every summer. Located just a few minutes away from NASA's Mission Control, the camp played host to about 100 to 150 kids aged 6 to 16, and by all accounts, had an absolutely sterling record amongst both those who attended as campers and as counselors. And it was here that Frank Abagnale, decked out in his uniform, claiming to be a furloughed Delta pilot due to a real-life gas crisis at the time, turned up asking for a summer job. The man who ran/owned the camp, Tom Manchin, was similar to Reverend Underwood, whom Frank had dealt with before, a man with a golden reputation in his community that ultimately just wanted to help anyone he could. And so, a bit gobsmacked that a pilot would want to hang out there for the summer, but seeing the potential for his people to have such a person with them, he hired Frank to act as a bus driver for the kids commuting in from the nearby neighborhoods that were not staying at the camp, and also as a general gopher that Frank described to anyone who would listen as being Tom Manchin's personal advisor. Remember, this was during the days of anyone working with kids requiring a background check, so Frank was true to pattern, able to successfully con another good-natured person into seeing the best in him. Another former pattern he would follow was to befriend a younger, impressionable person to take advantage of, this time a fellow counselor named Morris, whom after Frank discovered was a truly gifted graphic artist, lied his way into getting his new friend to design an ID badge for him that he claimed he wanted to take to some of the higher-ups at Delta. And in doing this, he scored the most legitimate-looking piece of his pilot's getup by a country mile. It wasn't just Morris, though, that Frank tried to befriend, essentially being remembered by any of the people who worked there with him as being the old dude trying to impress and fit in with the post-teen crowd by flashing cash around as much as he could and telling outlandish, braggadocious tales. He also apparently garnered a reputation amongst the females there as being the overly flirty, pervy old man every woman ever has worked with at some point.
Yeah, you remind me of them old players that be up in the club with them young girls.
One of those ladies who was extremely put off by Frank was Jan Jackson, whose father weirdly actually did work as a Delta pilot. See, he knew something Frank apparently didn't, and that was that Delta was one of the few airlines who didn't furlough their pilots that summer. And once his daughter raised suspicions of the goofy dude claiming to work where her dad did, he quickly upended the grift and reached out to Tom Manchin to let him know he had an imposter in the mix. Before he could be confronted, though, Frank was suddenly gone again. He had apparently worn out his welcome with a lot of the younger crowd by this point, and so he became the victim of a prank where he was doused with a bucket of water, after which he furiously left in a huff, not knowing this had bought him a bit of time. Not long, though, as it was soon discovered that many things belonging to the camp had come up missing, and now with a prime suspect, Tom Manchin alerted the authorities, who picked Frank up soon after on August 29, 1974. Pictured here looking like a second-rate Saul Goodman. Frank would be bailed out by his girlfriend at the time, and despite knowing she would be out that money if he tried to go on the run, that's exactly what he did, attempting to disguise himself and use the ID that he had his buddy Morris make up for him to escape on another international flight. But he got caught again. In yet another stroke of luck for Frank, around this time his parole officer had been reassigned, and he was now answering to a man named Jim Blackman, a deeply religious man who had a far more compassionate idea of corrections, seeing rehabilitation as a better path than punishment. It's not entirely clear what strings were pulled, but Frank ends up getting out of most of these charges with having them reduced to misdemeanors or dropped entirely, and is soon living with his parole officer in his garage. Yet again, Frank is in a position where his mistakes could put him behind bars for a long sentence and forever alter his life, and again, he skates by on the kindness of a sympathetic heart. Jim Blackman gives Frank a chance at a fresh start, and now surely we've seen the last of his fucking people over, right?
It's false. No way. Not this time.
He seemingly makes another attempt to make an honest living when he begins working a job for Aetna Insurance in October of 1975, but he's not able to resist the urge to scratch the itch for long, and while at their corporate training headquarters, he cashes 4 bad checks again in his own name on a bogus account. But he's obviously quickly found out and yet again is let off easy as Aetna does not press criminal charges, although court records show they did make many attempts to square the debt with Frank in court. Jim Blackman has stated that it was at this point he gives Frank an in with a security company that led to him going off on his own to form Frank W. Abagnale and Associates in April 1976. Around this time is when he first starts giving small lectures at any place that will have him, claiming to have been working deep undercover for years at this point. It was while working undercover as a sociologist that he claims he met Houston local Kelly Welbs in 1975, and they would marry on November 3rd, 1976. He also later told a version where they met while he was working at a grocery store, presumably also undercover. Anyway, the wife effect goes into full effect when Kelly Welbs arrives, as I believe she is another instrumental piece to building the legend of Frank Abagnale. She appears early on in his promotional materials as his wife, but once Frank's Playboy exploits become part of his shtick, and it appears to play better with him being advertised as not married, she disappears from the picture and starts being referred to only as his secretary.
I hate when I go out on a date and it goes great, but the next day, my wife found out about it.
In reality, it is very likely she was behind the scenes for much of what is about to take place and acts as the business mind and right hand of Frank W. Abagnale and Associates. If 1976 was when the wheels started turning on the machine that was being crafted, 1977 is when the rubber hits the road as things begin to take off quickly. On January 29th, Frank gives his first publicized live speech at McAdams Junior High School in Dickinson, Texas, and by all accounts from the local papers, absolutely crushes it and has the audience eating up every bit of his larger-than-life tale that ends in reform and redemption with him now on the side of the good guys. A couple of days prior to this event, as part of the little bit of promoting that was being done, Frank does an interview with the Galveston Daily News, and amongst his recanting of his tale, he first mentions Fred DeMera, a legend as far as actual imposters go, with an incredible story that is the subject of a 1961 movie called The Great Imposter. DeMera's accounts of successfully impersonating a Navy surgeon, schoolmaster of an elite high school, a law graduate, an assistant warden of a Texas state prison, and a PhD professor at 2 separate universities were all verifiable. And really, they should remake the story about him because he was clearly a fascinating guy. If you hadn't noticed, Frank pretty obviously borrowed heavily from DeMera's story for his own. They even used the same anecdote about staying a chapter ahead of students as they were teaching. He has shied away from any mentions of him in recent history, though, not wanting to draw the connection any longer. However, Frank himself is once quoted as asking, "Well, if it is all fake and I impersonated the great imposter, doesn't that make me a better imposter?" To which I would reply, "No, it makes you a cheap knockoff, a wannabe, an imitation." Shortly after the Galveston article hits, this story is picked up and syndicated by United Press International, so it starts appearing in papers everywhere throughout Texas. One crucial thing to point out, though, is that the version that went out to the masses left out the final portion of the original article, where the author stated the following: "I'm just waiting for someone to call me with the news that Abagnale is really just a little old pizza twirler and this is all just a con. But he had a sincere look in his eye. I couldn't help it. I wanted to believe him." This would be the catalyst, though, for Frank to begin going mainstream, and later that spring, he began shopping his photo and story to any media outlet that would have it, which would lead to him getting a massive break when he landed the cover photo of the Sunday edition of the Houston Chronicle with a 5-page feature story to go with it. At the time, the Chronicle had one of the widest distributions and reaches in the entire country, so this was an important next step in the star he was trying to cultivate. It also proved pivotal for another reason, because the man who ended up conducting the interview for the article was a journalist by the name of Stan Redding, who ended up going on to co-author Frank's autobiography that we mentioned earlier. With corroboration by a major publication, the national speaking circuit quickly came calling, and Frank was off to the races, giving speeches across the nation. This leads us back to the very beginning of the movie, to his appearance on To Tell the Truth on May 10th, 1977, which was a huge moment in his career that you can now put into proper context.
Yeah, I had a case where the police had my hotel room surrounded in Atlanta. I went out the back door and I had a suit on. As I stepped out the back door, two officers came around the corner and they said, "Hey, you, hold it." And I just turned around to them and said, "My name is Davis, FBI." And they said, "Oh, excuse me, sir." And I sent them around back front.
To Tell the Truth was canceled shortly after his appearance, though to be fair, it was on the decline for quite some time. From there, he scores an interview with legendary journalist Tom Brokaw on The Today Show. And then, on April 6th, 1978, the holy grail of bookings comes in the form of Frank giving a coveted spot on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. At the time, being on Carson was the seal of approval that signified you had gone from nameless to famous in the eyes of the public, and this served as an endorsement to the oncoming wave of people looking to get a piece of this story, with nearly all assuming that the verification portion of it had already been done and just running with it.
That's what's known
Sorry,
as...
folks, yes, double jeopardy.
No, that's what's known as hooking the hooker.
I'm hooking the hooker.
His appearance on Carson would cause some controversy with a portion of the public who thought that the show seemed to be glorifying his criminal acts, and so Frank returns for another appearance the next month as a means to clear the air, so to speak, and reinforce the message that crime doesn't pay. Two people who were watching Carson that first night from their home in Louisiana, though, were Bud and Charlotte Parks. And needless to say, they were flabbergasted by the story they were seeing being told by the man that had conned them all those years ago. They did attempt to reach out to the people at The Tonight Show to tell them who Frank really was, but it went nowhere. They weren't the only ones either, as the Louisiana Bar Association also tried the same thing to assert that Abagnale had in fact never worked for them, and they also did not get anywhere. Which is lucky for old Frank, because not only did they have each other's missing pieces of the story, but had the ADA in Louisiana been able to speak to the Parks, it may have jogged his memory, because in a cruel bit of irony, it was the same ADA that had originally prosecuted Frank all those years ago for his vagrancy charges. And he was in fact there in 1969, just under different circumstances. Following this, Frank is booked to speak at the International Platform Association's yearly conference at the beginning of August in 1978. This was another huge endorsement for him, as this was the equivalent of being invited to give a TED Talk nowadays. By all accounts, Frank was well received, and this would prove to be another pivotal moment, as there were two people in the audience that day that would end up being important characters in regards to his burgeoning career as a premier public speaker. One of them was Mark Zinder, who at the time was just an upstart 23-year-old kid, having landed a job fresh out of college for New Line Entertainment, working for their branch that booked speakers for college campuses. He was impressed with Frank's performance, and although he would not officially be an employee until 2 years later in 1980, this is for all intents and purposes when Mark Zinder begins to act as Frank's booking agent, working in the background, getting him scheduled all across the country on the college lecture circuit. The other person in attendance that day was a professor at Stephen F. Austin University named William Toney, and while at the time Toney just wrote Frank off as a blowhard storyteller who somehow conned his way onto the stage that night, it would not be the last time these two would cross paths. Frank follows this up with his third appearance on Carson a couple of months later on October 4th, 1978, and while they rehashed his already now famous story, he also added new details that had never before been divulged. I've gone into a bank, even under hidden camera just to prove a point, and pulled up in a Rolls Royce with a chauffeur, $300 suit with a cane and gloves, and walked in and wrote a check on a paper napkin. And the teller has cashed it. When I asked why she cashed a napkin for a check, she said that when she saw me come into the bank, getting out of the Rolls Royce, dressed the way I was, she would have cashed a roll of toilet paper if I had given it to her.
Nobody can keep their eyes off the pinstripes.
He also told the story of hiring the stewardesses and going to Europe that everyone has come to know, and for good measure told a rousing caper of conning unsuspecting businesses out of money by putting up a sign that the night deposit at the First National City Bank at Boston's Logan International Airport was out of order, and then posing as a security guard there to collect them, then further conning Massachusetts state troopers to help him load it when he thought they were about to bust him. The crowd loved it, but having a laugh at law enforcement's expense would turn out to bring the only type of attention to Frank's story that he didn't want: people trying to verify it. San Francisco Chronicle beat reporter Stephen S. Hall turned out to be a fantastic investigative journalist, and something about the wild stories Frank Abagnale told the world did not sit well with him. So he began digging. He first began with the most recent anecdote about the Dropbox and pretty easily found that to be untrue due to the fact that no such bank exists. Furthermore, Hall spoke with an executive at a similarly sounding bank in the area to see if there were any answers to be had, and was told by a bank spokesperson that he had also investigated the claims and found there to be no merit to them. Frank has claimed that many of his accounts were not reported by the superiors of those he conned, simply out of being super totally embarrassed by his hoodwinkery, but this could not be true in this case especially because there are federal mandates that require a bank to report a theft to this degree, and there was none anywhere in the area during this time. Next, he contacted the hospital that Frank claimed to have been a resident at and also found that to be untrue. For one, because they did not even have residents at the time. Also, Hall spoke to an executive administrator who had been there since they opened their doors and, due to the small staff, had pretty much known everyone who had worked there, and asserted Frank had never been there. The attorney claims were next to fall as he contacted the DA where Frank claimed to have worked and found that they had already been reaching out to Carson to debunk it, and noted again this would be a matter of public record and they could not hide it even if they wanted to. He then contacted BYU and spoke to reps there that assured him that since the university was a religious institution, that no one would get hired without references from advisors in that field and an extensive background check. We can tell you who taught here since 1935. We know who everyone was and where they are now, and this guy was not one of them under any name. There isn't even the remote possibility. Hall published his findings in an article 2 days later on October 6, 1978, titled, "Johnny is Conned, a Convict Who Makes Up Crimes." And I think that Movie Frank says it best himself.
This is irrefutable evidence that the defendant is in fact lying.
Frank initially wrote this off, but the press must have been bad enough that a few days later, he leaves town and is forced to bail on a gig that would have been his biggest live crowd yet. However, luckily for him, the bad press had been limited to just the Bay Area of Cali, and so he moved right on to another unsuspecting audience for his touring circus in the form of Oklahoma City. He went right back at it, giving paid seminars advising on how to prevent being ripped off by people like him, and on December 14th, 1978, he was booked for a lecture at the local Holiday Inn. But in the midst of the promo machine running for the upcoming appearance, he would again land on the radar of another person suspicious of his claims. And if Stephen Hall put Frank in the hot seat, Ira Perry absolutely fucking cooks him. A lot of what was found out mirrored what had been just uncovered in San Francisco, but Perry also spoke with former FBI agent Eugene Stewart, who we spoke about earlier, who fact-checked Frank's claims of stealing millions of dollars from the airlines. It never happened. I've checked with the security people and everyone here. You don't forget $2.5 million in bad checks. I'd say this guy is as phony as a $3 bill. Part of Frank's press kit included photos you see here, taken of him during his various careers worked as a professor, doctor, pilot, and lawyer. Now, apart from him looking like a 40-year-old in all of these, when remember, he was supposed to be a teenager that is apparently beating the ladies away with a stick, it was pointed out and later corroborated by Mark Zinder that these were pretty obviously taken for promotional materials as they included some serious historical issues. One of which we can see here, as Mr. Pibb was not even invented until after his alleged time at BYU.
He's not one of those doctor sodas, putting on airs and flashing around his Ivy League diploma.
No, Mr. Pibb earns his paycheck. He's the kind of soda I'd like to have a beer with.
He also began busting Frank's burgeoning new grift of being the anti-fraud hero of the business world, uncovering that despite having just publicly claimed to have worked for retailer Neiman Marcus and saved them $3 million in internal losses the previous year, in reality, he had given one talk about bad checks to a local store staff that employed about a dozen people. During his attempts to get a statement directly from Frank after his fact-checking spree, Ira Perry came into contact with Frank's agent at the time, Margelle DeLauer, who was quite a character in her own right that fit right in with representing a con artist. DeLauer had once been a secretary for mobster Louis Strauss in the 40s and was actually in the car with him during an attempted high-speed escape from the cops while they attempted to bring him in on murder charges. She eventually flipped on Strauss, by the way, and cooperated with authorities once he was in custody. In a really fun and ironic twist, about 20 years later in 1968, she also claimed to have come across a massive collection of previously unseen documents belonging to Howard H. Hughes, the subject of another Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Aviator. She wrote a book based on the info she found, but was never able to produce any sort of proof of said documents, and when challenged with this would explain they were stolen from her apartment, which I've heard somewhere else also. Anyway, one undisputable thing about DeLauer was that she was an absolute bulldog when it came to defending against anyone who threatened her new meal ticket, and if a journalist started poking his nose around questioning legitimacy, she would respond in kind.
Go fuck yourselves.
Perry was told to contact the FBI and was given the name of former Atlanta agent Robert Frank. So that's what he did, and indeed, Frank was well aware of the WunderCon. That damn Abagnale uses my name all over the place, but I've never even met the guy. From there, Ira Perry contacted the people over The Tonight Show to see who had done the verification on Frank's story and whom they had spoken to, and much to his surprise, Johnny Carson's story checkers had only spoken to one person before taking it as gospel truth, Margelle DeLauer. Armed with all this research, Perry publishes his article on December 14th, the day that Frank is scheduled to make his appearance at the Holiday Inn. And once again, with no real pushback against the bad press or denial, Frank packs up and gets out of Dodge, having to no-show another huge opportunity. But just as before, the expose was limited to just the area in which it was printed, and so Frank was able to continue crafting his narrative elsewhere. And from here, he and his agent would be sure to be much more careful. 1979 would see him appearing on more of the big names like Phil Donahue and Mike Douglas, and another stint on The Tonight Show when George Carlin was guest hosting, all while also fielding a nearly full schedule of paid speeches being booked by Mark Zinder. This whirlwind of promotion and press was leading up to the ultimate culmination of Frank's book being released in the summer of 1980. And as we've covered, the book is part Frank's recounting of his quote-unquote life story up to that point, and part a greatest hits collection of all the capers he had told everyone in interviews and speeches over the years, but with the addition of Frank also filling us in on all the tang he got because of what an absolute total fuck machine he apparently was. I don't remember how she got in the car or where we went after she got in, but I do remember she was all silk, softness, nuzzly, warm, sweet-smelling, and absolutely delightful. And I knew that I had found a contact sport I could really enjoy. She did things to me that would lure a hummingbird from a hibiscus and make a bulldog break its chin.
Hello, pushy.
Like the scene we get in the movie when he paid for a lady of the night with a cashier's check that was more than their agreed upon amount so he could get some extra change off the Strange.
Even better.
Which Frank says when the real lady was questioned later that she was really only mad about being swindled out of $400, and she wasn't even mad about giving it away for free to him because he was such a grade A dick slinger. At the end of the day, though, people absolutely ate it up, and that probably had to do with just where the United States was at that time when it came to our national identity, to which I think journalist Randy Wheeler put it best when he was quoted in 1974. During the time which has seen America put its tail between his legs and retreat from a no-win war, then watched in awe as first its VP and then president resigned in humiliation, the nation has been ripe for the emergence of a high-class national hero. Around this point is when Frank convinces Mark Zinder to leave New Line and take on a role as his official booking agent. And I'm not going to tell you all of his experiences of serving as the alphabet of Frank's whiz and then finding out behind the curtain there is no real power, but I do want to share one because I think it speaks to a lot of who Frank is as a person. See, Frank had a habit of needing to go back to do a victory lap in places that he once got busted scamming people in at a much, much later date. He would do it in Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, and also seemingly when Frank goes back home to see his mother shortly after the book is released and brings Mark with him. Paulette was living with her new husband by this point, and Frank came dressed to the nines with grandiose stories in order to impress her, according to his former agent, but got a less than happy homecoming. His mother was very cold and standoffish. The conversation was so forced and strained. She did not seem pleased to see him. It felt weird and really awkward. In retrospect, I can see how Frank was trying to win her approval, but she was wary and did not seem to trust him. Now I understand why, knowing just how many times she had been called by police informing her Frank had been arrested again. She must have been expecting his latest ruse to be discovered. Now, far be it for me to imply that in the movie his mother being depicted as a gold-digging hooer was Frank's doing, because I can't say that for certainty. But if it was, I think it's pretty awesome to know that his mother got the last laugh in a way though, because the letter she wrote to Reverend Underwood while Frank was awaiting trial in Louisiana would end up being the clue that brought to light Frank's previous prison terms in New York, the thing that completely busted the timeline he had been selling. The coup de grace, if you will. Anyway, 1980 and most of 1981 was packed with appearances on the college circuit, with Frank pulling a hefty sum for each one by this point. But a very pivotal moment comes on November 17, 1981, when he appears at Stephen F. Austin University to an adoring crowd. And to Frank, this was probably just another performance he nailed and a check to cash. But he had unknowingly made a big mistake. This is where college professor Bill Toney we mentioned earlier comes back into play, and he had pretty much forgotten the obvious huckster he had seen at the IPA conference a few years prior. But now the man was back and filling his students' heads with nonsense. At this point, Toney puts Frank in his crosshairs, and between himself and his team of students, they go to work dissecting his wide range of stories, debunking them all like the journalists before them, even unearthing their work as part of the digging. With this full clip of information, Bill Toney planned to give a public takedown and set sights on the upcoming 1982 IPA conference. The same place that had helped launch Frank's career a few years prior was now poised to possibly end it. Frank was unaware at the time though, because he was dealing with some internal fires in the form of a falling out with his agent Mark Zinder. As part of their original agreement, Mark was due a $5,000 bonus should he be able to hit certain marks for booking his client, which he did. But much to his chagrin, Frank tried to renege on the deal and act as though there was no such agreement. This was the final straw for Mark, who had overlooked other times Frank had done him dirty business-wise, and the two had an altercation that ended with Frank paying what he owed, but firing his agent at the same time. Zinder was taken aback by the termination, but endeavored to rebuild his brand with new clients, which he was successful at doing, going on to rep many famous stand-up comedians and a talented illusionist named the Amazing Kreskin. Frank very suddenly realized how much his operation had truly lost with this though, and his bookings soon tanked. This would lead him to come crawling back, agreeing to whatever was necessary to get his former agent back.
Ah, so you come crawling back, you cheap sack of shit.
Mark saw it as nothing more than a business move, and with Frank having been a reliable client as far as the performance side, he decided he was better off with him on his roster than not. However, Mark Zinder had no idea that he had just reboarded a sinking ship, because once Bill Toney gave his speech at the IPA in summer of 1982, the word began to spread across the college circuit. And when Mark went back to promoting as he had before, he began finding out the jig might be up. After being confronted himself by Toney's students while setting up a promo booth about his client actually being a fraud, Mark attempted to contact Frank for clarification and also to warn him that he may be walking into a confrontation. But not only was there no answer on the phone, Frank Abagnale bailed entirely on the appearance. Soon after this though, those who had booked appearances began to cancel, and some, like the University of South Carolina, agreed to have him come in should he be willing to sign a truth affidavit, which he was not at all willing to do. This was when Mark began to see everything for what it was, and that he might have been shilling for a liar this whole time. The two did eventually speak, where he let Frank know that he knew that it was all a sham, and to which his client replied simply that he could make this all disappear for $5,000. And with that interpreted veiled threat, their relationship ended. Curiously, at this exact same time, Frank Abagnale decides that he is going to retire from the college lecture circuit, as his cons are not something to which young, impressionable minds should be exposed, and instead starts playing to a new audience that coincidentally just happened to be completely removed from his previous one, corporate bankers, and by the end of 1982, he was back being accepted again by a cheering audience, none the wiser of his bullshit. Over the next decade plus, Frank lets the bad press evaporate, and he slowly rebuilds his paper kingdom held together with cement lies, over time changing his shtick away from the womanizing playboy to better align with America's growing family values-centered culture. All the while, he also had to deal with several lawsuits from his former agent, Professor Bill Toney, and a multitude of other people he would swindle out of investment fees he never intended to pay back. Mark moved on completely from this and went on to have a pretty successful career in the financial sector, unfortunately being haunted by the undying specter of Frank's legend when it regained strength after lying dormant. And while he tried at times over the years to shed truth on it, he would ultimately succumb to the indifference anytime he attempted, only recently giving his full story as part of the 2020 exposé. By the late 90s, Frank had settled in Oklahoma with his wife and 3 kids, having seemingly figured out the correct mix of enough fame to get speaking gigs, now charging a whopping $15,000 a pop for, but also staying enough out of the light that he needn't worry anymore. If only he hadn't sold the rights of his life for that pesky movie. As far back as the days of the book coming out, talks had been had about developing it into a feature film, with Frank even once claiming Dustin Hoffman was studying his every move in 1975 when he was first tapped to play him, which, knowing what we know now that Frank was living in his parole officer's garage at the time, the idea of that is even funnier. In reality, after his initial TV appearances is when Hollywood first showed interest in his story. He entered into an option contract with Bud Yorkin in 1979. After 2 years, though, Yorkin told him he was no longer interested. This was perfect for Frank, as he got to pocket some money basically for nothing and got to retain the rights to his story. So he sells it again a couple of times over the next several years to outlets like Columbia TV and Grosso Jacobson, both ending with the same result of them not making it and Frank getting it back and getting to keep the money. Director/producer Hal Bartlett is next to option the movie rights in 1986 for a 4-year agreement, and by this time, the imaginary talks of Dustin Hoffman being considered for the role of Frank had graduated to real-life conversations of a young Tom Cruise taking the lead, with the Coen brothers being considered for the directing gig at one point apparently. After those 4 years, Frank hoped to see the movie rights return to him like all the other times before, but Bartlett instead paid the full purchase price of $250,000 for the movie rights, and it is at this point Frank officially loses all control and rights over the movie, which would turn out to be a bit of a thorn in his side later on, as we're about to find out. Then in 1990, independent producer Michael Shane buys the rights from Bartlett for $300,000. He then optioned the movie to Hollywood Pictures, a division of Disney, but they pass on it after the 2-year agreement. He options again to Sony TriStar for 1 year, and nothing there either. Then, finally, in 1996, Barry Kemp and Bungalow 78 optioned the rights for 2 years and took the project to Walter Parks and Laurie McDonald, Steven Spielberg's producers at SKG DreamWorks, then still a starting film studio. Now, while Frank had been on board for a movie initially, this was prior to him really getting grilled over his story and having to defend it to the lengths that he did. By the time the film was set to be a reality, he had realized this was going to possibly raise alarms once again if people started digging. This is why he had already been walking back many things by this point, or more importantly, blaming anyone he could for embellishing or taking him out of context. He also confessed to Andy Seiler of USA Today at the premiere of the movie that the impersonations in the autobiography were fabricated. I impersonated a doctor for a few days, I was a lawyer for a few days. In the book, it's like I'm doing this for a year. Despite this admission, he would return to his normal form shortly after this, though. Another tactic he took to was to shift blame to his co-author Stan Redding, like we mentioned earlier, for taking all sorts of liberties that he did not know about, which was easy to do considering Stan had long since passed away by that time with no means to rebut. Eventually, this graduated to telling a national conference of CPA practitioners in 2014 that he had virtually nothing to do with either version of his Life Stories production.
I don't know what the fuck are you talking about.
Now, while Stan Redding was a known liar with a reputation for a willingness to stretch the truth for a story, using him as a scapegoat sorta went out the window when it was later discovered that there is a story told by Frank himself in the magazine True Detective from January of 1978 that is basically the same life story that would be told in his book a couple of years later. As far as the actual person that was serving as Frank's consigliere in lie crafting, well, that wouldn't come out for some time, but once it did, it made perfect sense. Back in 1976, when Frank was first beginning to move into the public speaking racket, he happened to somehow catch the eye of a man named Leo Langolis. Described as one of America's greatest hidden persuaders, Leo was an award-winning ad man instrumental in the propaganda film/advertisement industry. In fact, if you're familiar with the famous duck and cover video teaching kids a foolproof way to avoid nuclear Armageddon, then you have seen his work.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
But surprisingly, that would be only the second biggest load of bullshit that Langolis produced because, as it turns out, he was quite the opportunist and looked at Frank Abagnale and saw what could be, that there was a lucrative story here if it were crafted the right way. And so Leo Langolis partnered with Frank Abagnale to not only craft, but polish the turd that they would push out onto the American people's chest in the form of a book/movie deal. And it is with his connections and organization that Frank goes from small-time high schools to network television in incredibly short order. Now, no one can say for sure why, but their relationship severs in 1978, and we know this because of a lawsuit that was filed that is now a matter of public record. The details of this lawsuit are very interesting indeed because they indicate that Langolis Communications were responsible for creating a massive marketing campaign, and they were suing Frank for their intellectual property, instructing him to turn over all materials created, including those that were designed to commercially exploit the life history of Frank W. Abagnale, whether by books, articles, or other written materials, or by film, videotape/slide, film strip, records, or other audio/visual materials dating back to January 1976. The main material in question is a Langolis-produced short film entitled Catch Him If You Can, starring the real Frank Abagnale, showing us how to pull off rudimentary cons. Leo Langolis also used his government connections to try to get records pertaining to any agreements made between Frank and Stan Redding, which would allude to the fact that Frank likely tried to backdoor his benefactor and cut his own deal. This dragged out for years in court in the ensuing legal battles, and eventually the two did settle under undisclosed terms. None of this mattered when it came down to it, however, as even though there were some questions raised in articles around the movie's release, and some of those who recognized Frank's story as being false certainly had a good laugh at it, having Hollywood heavyweights like Spielberg, Hanks, and DiCaprio signing off on it made most of that just background noise. Catch Me If You Can went on to become a smash hit, making hundreds of millions of dollars, and it did have a great majority of people that took it at face value for a long time, myself included. It spawned a Broadway musical that, while critics described as not translating as well to the stage, it still landed Norbert Theo Butz a Tony Award for Best Actor for his depiction of Frank, and it made a truckload more money for the machine now simply known as Catch. This was all much to the chagrin of the real Frank Abagnale, as he only got a small piece of it, having no longer technically owned it, and he was forced to watch others profit off his tales in a score that he could only imagine. What it did do for him, though, for a time is the opposite of what he feared. It re-legitimized him for another decade plus, being able to capitalize financially off of it in the form of lucrative appearances again, such as when he was invited for a 2017 Talks at Google podcast appearance where he repeated most of the same bullshit he had been since the 70s, but left out or altered a couple of major old stories, like the airplane escape through the toilet, which he now blames on Spielberg and claims that it was through the kitchen galley that he actually made his escape. Google has since disabled comments on the video and added a disclaimer. Things were looking good for Frank to ride out his shtick for however long he cared to, and that the perception had defeated the reality in the end when it came to what the story of his life would be. That was until fairly recently when irrefutable proof finally came to light, tanking the last remnants of doubt that he tried to stand on. The crescendo of the 2020 book is amazing, and it sees Paula Parks going to a book signing in Baton Rouge to finally confront Frank when he returns for another victory lap that same year that the book would come out. Essentially, Paula approached and asked Frank to sign a book for her parents that he had defrauded and stole from all those years ago, Bud and Charlotte Parks, and to write that he is sorry for what he did to them. Frank was visibly shaken, but downplays knowing Paula or anything she is referring to. And when she tries to get him to admit to his previous arrests in Baton Rouge, he deflects to working for the FBI, and that he still works for the FBI even to that day. The confrontation does not produce any sort of admissions, but it does end in Frank being forced to sign the book for the Parks family with a simple, cold, "I'm sorry" written below it. A moral win if nothing else. He was then confronted at Xavier University on September 12, 2022, while hilariously receiving the Heroes in Ethics Award, when Jim Grinstead, host of the podcast Scams and Cons, asked him point blank, "I wonder if in the light of the ethics award you're going to be presented tonight, would you come clean? Will you admit that you just lied to everybody and that you are still conning them?" To which Frank denied having ever told any lies about his life and reiterated his new talking point that he has nothing to do with the book, the movie, or the musical. You can also see a similar interaction here between him and podcaster Javier Leiva.
One more. So for 6 years, we evaded the FBI, pretending to be a pilot, a doctor, a professor. But how were you able to do that if you were like sitting in prison the whole time?
No, when this was all I went to prison for all those things. Going to work with the FBI was after I came out of prison.
But I have your prison records right here, and clearly it took place when you were supposedly doing all these adventures.
Came over a period of time, not predicted in the movie. It had nothing to do. I didn't write the book. I didn't make the movie. I didn't have anything to do with the play. Those are people's views of what I did or didn't do at that time.
And look, I'm not saying that should you get the chance to go see Frank live at a book signing or other appearance, that you should go and ask him to sign your book also for Bud and Charlotte Parks and to include an apology for fucking them over. And I'm not saying that you should shower him with booze or heckle him with taunts of like, "Frank, epic fail," or I don't know, you'll think of something. But you know, those are just some things that some people might choose to do, and I'm just saying that's a choice that can be made.
Get off the stage, you dick!
And throughout all of this, I have been asking myself over and over again the same question. If this story has been so thoroughly debunked at so many stops along the way over the years, how did it ever get to this point? And how does someone fool so many people for so long with such obvious bullshit? And look, I'm not going to sit here and say that Frank Abagnale is not a gifted swindler and con man. He most certainly is. And there is no taking that away from him, as the list of people he has ripped off in some fashion is lengthy. And then when you get meta with it and start factoring in that he has successfully sold a load of bullshit for decades and faked it till he made it so hard that people started buying it. Look at his first appearance on Carson, for instance. Frank actually successfully cons the world on national television into believing he was already an accomplished writer, with his only publication at the time having been a word-for-word reprint of Stan Redding's story that appeared in the Houston Chronicle, that he advertised as now being in its 7th printing. And having been exposed now to some legit people in the industry and himself now hung around for a few decades, he has most assuredly picked up some real knowledge on the subject. But true to his pattern, however, a small grain of truth can flower a money tree. And this is likely why, when it comes down to the reality of his consulting work, a recurring review seems to be that he didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. I think a lot of Frank's success and staying power comes back to that old adage of it being easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. And part of it can also be chalked up to simply the time that we live in, where an entertaining lie told enough times is often better than an inconvenient truth, where many create their own images of who they want their hero to be and accept it as gospel. perfectly encapsulated by Mark Zinder remembering fielding questions about whether or not Frank found redemption through religion. People from the crowds would often ask me that, so I did ask him if he had, but he just scoffed at the question and waved me off. Shortly after that, though, the instructions came down from Frank that from then on, Mark was to tell people that yes, he had indeed found God.
Yes, I am a Lutheran.
See, because at the end of the day, Frank is whoever he needs to be on that day, and I guess in that way, he kind of is a successful imposter. But in that same vein, part of what Frank is getting out of his grift is also the adulation and wanting to be liked, which is why he leaves out his real escapades to be seen as someone more akin to Robin Hood, who stole only from those who it wouldn't affect, and that he paid every dollar back that he ever stole anyway. And you don't get it. It's not because Frank ever wanted to hurt anyone. He just loved the challenge, and even psychiatrists have deemed him to have a low criminal threshold. One of the New York cops who worked hardest to catch me read the report and snorted, "This head doctor's gotta be kidding us. This phony rips off several hundred banks, swindles half the hotels in the world for everything but the sheets, screws every airline in the skies, including most of their stewardesses, passes enough bad checks to pay for the walls of the Pentagon, runs his own goddamn colleges and universities, makes the cops in 20 countries look like dumbasses while he's stealing over $2 million, and he has a low criminal threshold? What in the hell would he have done if he had a high criminal threshold? Looted Fort Knox?" The fact of the matter, though, is that the overwhelming majority of people who were victims of Frank's fuckery were small business owners, unsuspecting employees of the places he wrote bad checks to that were left holding the bag, and those he made believe that he was a friend to, only to backstab and steal from them at any opportunity. The same types of common, normal, everyday people that would go on to unknowingly help elevate him to celebrity status. He would have you believe he is a redemptive tale of a misguided youth that achieved the American dream in his own rebellious way.
Throughout human history, people have come to these shores to pursue the American dream, life, liberty, and the chance to exploit others and get one over on your fellow man.
In reality, he represents some of the worst parts of America and its willingness to hero worship and egomaniacal fraud. An obvious, petty criminal that would backstab anyone if it stood to benefit him. A bumbling idiot who wants you to believe he is a genius. The new American hero. That's all for this time, real ones. What did you think?
Do you concur?
Let me know what you thought down below and what real story would you like to see next. Make sure to do all the things to all the buttons, and if you want to help a brother out, head over to the Patreon where you can get early access to videos and you will get a producer credit on them, which is somehow actually more valid than most of Frank Abagnale's claims. Anyways, thanks for watching. As always, see you on another time.